We'd like to welcome everyone. We are ready to start. We're so excited to have everyone join us to get some questions answered. We will be answering questions that are dropped in the chat, and we are recording so we can provide this to people later on. So if you have any questions, we have some moderators that are keeping an eye on the chat, and we will take it from there. So welcome, Julie. Would you just go ahead and introduce yourself really quick for people who don't know who you are, and then we'll take it from there.
Sure. My name is Julie King. I am the school board representative for ASD that serves Eagle Mountain, Cedar Fort, Fairfield, and the northern part of Saratoga Springs. I am in my 6th year of serving on the board.
Awesome. So today we're talking about the district split. Can you just kind of give us a little bit of background, context, and history as to how we got to this place?
Sure. District split has been considered a couple of times over the past 20 years. Something that's been addressed multiple times and kind of never really progressed forward. The district considered a district split going through MGT, which is a company that we hired to conduct a feasibility study. That's a requirement when you go forward considering a district split, is the feasibility study that predominantly deals with financial dynamics. All of the things that are required to be in a feasibility study are currently already outlined in code. The same time that we were going through that, another board member and I were working to get a board to ballot option. Prior to this, there was no straight board to ballot option. Prior to the 2024 legislative session, it was that the school board could go to the county commission could form an ad hoc committee. They give a recommendation to the county, and then the county would decide. We felt like it was better to have a straight board to ballot option. So that was one of the pieces that we advocated for. At the same time, we had cities watching very, very closely. There were 3 other ways you could bring forward a district split. A city could trigger it, which happened in Prop 2 with Orem in 2022. An interlocal can create it, which is basically a group of cities, which is the situation we're in now. And then the third one is basically when you have a citizens initiative come forward, you have a certain percentage of citizens who ask for that to be placed on a ballot.
Awesome. It looks like Melissa has some questions for you. So why don't you give us the first question, Melissa?
Yeah, so Monica is here. Hello, Monica. She's asking about this. She said that she's heard if the split passes, Alpine District would no longer be able to pass bonds. Is that true? Can you verify or explain how that works?
Yeah, so it's kind of a little bit of a complicated dynamic. So one of the pieces in code, we had a change to how lease revenue bonds could be taken out in the 2024 legislative session, essentially capping those. So there was a significant concern when that bill went into place, which was in effect as of May 1st. So that presented some challenges for us. Another piece of the legislation is that when a split is occurring, one of the concerns that we talked about quite a bit was that you didn't want to have something where, like, for example, lease revenue bonds would be triggered and then other cities would be responsible for that ongoing. So one of the dynamics right now is that a new board cannot GO or lease revenue bond until they're officially taking over educational services, which would be in 2027. All of the school board was fully aware of the ramifications of that if we did not put forward a lease revenue bond or a GO bond, that it would really hamper that moving forward. One of the dynamics I have brought forward, which we've discussed with the high school in Saratoga, is that we're willing to take on the debt associated with that school. There's some challenges with that because of the code. I will say that I am floating ideas to legislators about how to move forward. It's not just the Saratoga Springs High School, which is obviously the biggest thing in our area. It's also about the rebuild of PG and AF High. They need the final phases of that done. There are seismic concerns with several of the elementary schools. We want to make sure that whatever ends up happening on November 5th, that all areas are able to move forward meeting their capital needs. So working with legislators on how to free up some of those dynamics so that we can move forward to making sure that capital needs are met across the district and that there isn't a significant pause on that.
All right, we've got another question from Laura. Thanks for being here asking questions. She's asking about if the 4 cities have created a West District map for school board districts. So maybe the question would be more to explain kind of the process with school board and how the zoning works with that going forward.
For sure. So basically what happens is, and I'll just give you an example because we did this after the 2020 census was done. Basically what happens is the amount of people, so essentially like your, the number of citizens within an area, it's divided by those 7 people, and you can go plus or minus 5%. And there's all these kind of complex configurations about how you can't cross Senate lines and precinct lines. It's basically a giant Sudoku puzzle, which feels really, really overwhelming. So basically, the county determines that. County elections will bring forward districts. And if we end up doing a 2-way or a 3-way, all of the districts would be large enough that they actually qualify for 7 school board members apiece. So it would be 7 people in each of those areas. It's done based on population. And then the county, basically, like I said, like elections brings a proposal forward, and then it's actually voted on by the county commission. And so the county commissioners actually determine the placement of all of those school board district seats. And then, like I said, there'd be 7 for each district.
Awesome. We've heard a lot of different questions from teachers and parents and taxpayers, and there's some commonly asked questions. What are some of the ones that you hear the most, Julie?
I think one of the ones is what's going to happen with our taxes, right? I think we're all taxpayers. We're all significantly concerned about that, what's happening with taxes. This one gets a little complicated to answer because really new boards are going to make the decisions as to what happens moving forward with taxes. But one of the things to be aware of is how basically it's determined as far as funding. About 64% of our income as a district comes from what's called WPU, or the weighted pupil unit. So basically that means kids and seats. When you have a lot of kids, you get a lot of WPU. And then property taxes make up about another 24%. Federal is about 10%, and the remaining 2% is things like gate fees at games, cell phone tower, rental fees, those kind of things. So when people ask me the question, are my taxes going to go up? My standard answer is yes. That's the way the certified tax rate works. It's very complicated. So really the question is, where do you want your taxes to go? Do you want them to stay specific to your area, or are you willing to have them cover a larger area? I will also say that when it comes to taxes, specifically for the West Side, I feel like we have a really strong dynamic. We have projected growth as far as our WPU, as well as our residential and commercial growth. So I feel very confident that we're going to have a very strong tax base moving forward. So really when it comes down to it is you need to decide where your taxes are going to go. The other dynamic I think coming into this to be aware of is that when you're looking at tax bases and what's going to determine it, one of the things we can look at is our surplus. We have a significant surplus on the West Side. We could potentially flip to a dynamic where we build in cash an elementary school every other year and then only choose to geo bond for secondary schools, which based on how we layer debt, which would significantly keep our tax base pretty solid and not fluctuating up and down a lot. And then as you can see on the slide that's been brought up about our adjusted taxable value growth, the West Side in particular, you're seeing a significant increase from about $9 billion to an increase of $48 billion. If you live over here, if you've just seen what's happened in the last year with Home Depot, all the things going on Redwood, the new Walmart coming into Eagle Mountain, databases that are, breaking ground, we have a lot of growth and a lot of potential in our area.
All right. What other questions have you heard a lot of, Julie?
Okay, so the tax one's a big one. Another one specifically for employees is really about what's going to happen with benefits and pay. So I think there's a lot of concern that it feels like ASD has been very, very stable as far as investing in teachers and employees, kind of addressing pay. So that's been one of the questions I hear is what will be protected and what will not. So currently in the code, there are dynamics that talk about how your seniority and accrued benefits are basically carried over. Right now in code, there's a year protection. I'm working with a senator who already has a bill file open, and we are looking at extending those protections significantly. So all of those things are protected for a full year, and hopefully, like I said, we'll have those extended through the bill that we're working on as well. One of the things that I think to look at too is the way that benefits have shifted, particularly with our medical insurance in the last couple of years, because of an increase in our usage rates. So while it's phenomenal and we enjoy dynamics with economies of scale, one of the challenges we're facing is that our economies of scale is not really protecting us when it comes to things like medical insurance increases because of our usage rate. So we're going to have to basically really tackle the usage piece, or we're in a pathway that's not sustainable currently. So I think one of the things that you're going to actually see is, I think it's most likely you're going to see a salary war dynamic where districts are going to compete to find the best employees. And that means they're going to offer solid packages, and that they're going to make sure that they are very competitive. It's not just us competing with the other districts. If ASD becomes, if the West Side becomes our own district, it's also competing with people like Jordan Canyons and Provo, that are sister districts that are very close to us. So I think we're going to see something where we actually have salary wars that will be beneficial to employees.
It looks like we have another question, Melissa. Go ahead and get that
Yeah,
one.
so this we can expand this. Can you just tell us where the process is of the high school in Saratoga? We've heard some rumors Laura's mentioned about they're already starting to dig. Could you just kind of clarify everyone where we stand right now with the building of a new high school in Saratoga?
Sure. We're basically kind of in a pause point. We're still pursuing the purchase of the land. We have not solidified that. We're basically essentially in escrow with the entity that we purchased, that, we've attempted to purchase the land from. So we're in escrow with them. We have not completed the sale. We have not paid for the entirety of the property at this point. We're doing soil samples and some other things. We also have architectural work where we are working with architects to design the school. We do not have all of the funding mechanisms in place. I did receive information this morning, someone asking me that question, like I'm hearing that, dirt is moving and ground has been broken. We're moving. That is incorrect. We do not own the property. If anybody's out there potentially moving dirt, it may be associated with the soil samples, but we do not own the property. We are in escrow with the property at this point.
I have another question I'm trying to completely understand. This comes from Katie. It says, along with taxes, one figure I keep hearing is that the East Side has paid 80% of our needs. How can we reasonably pay for things if it's gone? Maybe
Okay.
just thinking about the funding, where it goes.
Yeah, so I mean, that goes back to what's being talked about when they talk about that is basically how much do we contribute in property taxes? Right now, Saratoga Springs, Eagle Mountain, Cedar Fort, and Fairfield, we contribute roughly 20% of property taxes out of the district budget. So that's where a chunk of our capital funding comes from. We can also get capital dollars from things like WPU, which we also carry a significant amount on. So just one of the things to be aware of with that. So one of the things is I think I hear people say is, well, the East is carrying 80% of that. Well, if you break it down city by city, it's a little bit different, right? Lehigh is the largest taxpayer in the district as far as contributing to property taxes. Lehigh was supportive of the 2022 bond, as was Saratoga and Eagle Mountain. So first, as far as taxes, it goes Lehigh, second is Orem, then the West Side, the conglomeration of those four entities. We're number 3 on that list. So when it comes to it, how can we afford to pay for it? Well, in the MGT study, it showed that we would have anywhere from a $21 to a $27 million surplus every year. If we would completely pay for a $200 million bond on our own, it would be a little less than $15 million. We could cover that with the current surplus, and that does not take into account the 7 increments that we did this year as an ASD board, and it won't take into account any additional potential increases that happen in 25, 26 moving forward. So yes, the short answer is yes, we can afford to build our schools and resolve that.
All right, I have a question that came through from another source and I'll throw it your way, is asking what can happen to CTE and concurrent enrollment if the program's split? We've been hearing that a lot as well.
Yeah, so there have been concerns about DLI, and sorry, I'll try not to use all the acronyms because that's sometimes not very parent friendly. So dual language immersion, or our programs for kiddos who are learning a targeted language like Mandarin, Spanish, Portuguese, French. Then we also have ALL, which is Advanced Learning Lab. That's essentially our gifted and talented program. CTE is career and technical education, and CE is concurrent enrollment. So, and then I've also heard questions about special education. So basically all of those things are funded by the state or by the federal government or by both. So basically, you would receive funding essentially proportional to students who are accessing that. For dual language immersion and advanced learning lab, it's essentially if you have the right number of kids accessing it, there's not a ton of funding associated with it. And if you have appropriate amount of kids to fill those seats so that we're hitting our ratios that we need, like we would for a general education classroom, then I don't foresee any change in that. Concurrent enrollment is really based on partnerships with local universities and really student enrollment opportunities. So for example, Cedar Valley High School has the largest number of concurrent enrollment options because they have the most kids of any high school in the district. So part of it is based on things like what's a teacher certified in, what's the drive, those kind of things. CTE is a little bit different because career and technical education, we have different pathways that students can pursue. And there will be some dynamics, like, for example, I believe that the Interior Design 2 class is only taught by a Lone Peak teacher. So the reality is there may be some condensing of programs because if we would split, there would not be access to Interior Design 2. I also will say that I think cybersecurity is one that's taught throughout the district. But I also know that I have a teacher that is working on their certification for that. So the decisions specifically about CTE and concurrent enrollment really depend on the certification of the teachers, the partnerships that are there with universities, what kids are choosing to access. But those funding buckets essentially come from the state and the federal government. And then it's really up to those individual districts where and how they invest those dollars based on interest, certification, all those kind of things.
Okay, trying to keep up with the questions here. There was a question asking who is doing the outreach of the flyers, and I can cover that briefly. We have a group of parents, taxpayers, and teachers that have come together supporting this into a PIC, which is a political interest committee, and that's our vote yes on Prop 14. So that's kind of who's helping doing the websites and all the media that's going out. The next question I have here is both talking about building, so I'm going to put them together. Mandy asked that if we split, is it likely that the progress on the high school would actually be delayed? And then Laura was asking in terms of building, will we be able to build larger elementary schools that we don't need portables? So I think those are kind of building in general, what can it work in the future, bring the high school to process, and how long will it take to get those other needs elementaries as well?
Okay, so I'll address the elementary question first and then circle back to the high school one. So the elementary question, why don't we just build schools bigger? One of the challenges with that is we don't want to do something which is kind of references as overbuilding. We specifically build our buildings, the brick and mortars, because we want them to flex. We don't want it to be that like, this is the building, it's all there is. So we specifically build for our elementary schools. We specifically build in and plan for at least 4 portables to be at each school location. And then for our secondary schools, we usually build for portables and often satellites. The way that demographics work and the way that growth happens in municipalities is a lot of times you'll have a demographic shift where it comes in that you've got really young families and then they're coming in, and then as those families age out, then maybe instead of 4 kids in the house, now they're retirees. And so you don't want to create a dynamic where you have spent millions and millions and millions of dollars to overbuild and then you have empty and half empty schools. So as much as, people don't love portables and satellites, they do serve a purpose. They help us kind of stretch resources and not overbuild. And I understand that because the majority of schools on the west side already have portables and satellites and growth is projected. One of the things to consider too is that we have had roughly 20 years of really, really solid growth in Saratoga and Eagle Mountain. The cities themselves are only about 27 and 28 years old. We have at least another 40 years of growth. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is a lot of us who, like I'm at the phase where all of my kids have now graduated, that basically people my age who have grandkids are starting to experience the same thing that they had with their own children. So we have a couple of generational dynamics where we still have, a generation 2, maybe even 3 worth of growth that we're going to kind of be in this pattern. As far as the high school, I kind of tried to reference that a little bit earlier with some of the dynamics as far as kind of what's happening and the timeline with that. There are some challenges moving forward. There are some timeline pieces. And I will say that one of the things I'm specifically working on is I've thrown out a couple of ideas to legislators to resolve those issues ongoing. And like I said, it's not just the Saratoga Springs High School. There's also the rebuild phase 3 for AF and PG. So those are significant projects that obviously those areas want resolved. And then there's some schools with seismic issues. So I have a couple of ideas moving forward to update the code so that it is a fair dynamic for everyone while also not putting a full stop on builds during kind of that interim period.
Okay. Trying to manage. Did you answer the question about the timeline for the high school as well? That second part.
So the timeline, this is the part where it's going to get a little bit complicated, and I'm trying to be respectful that other people, I guess, have different opinions. The current dynamic with the high school is that it's on a pause. And it will be on a pause, and I will just say that it's a pause, and I'm looking for solutions moving forward.
Thank you. Okay. Along the same line, I'm going to go with a question from Heather. She has said that one reason I hear people say they are against the split is because we'll have to use all the money to build new district office buildings, bus garages, nutrition services, etc. Is this true, or are there other options so we aren't starting from scratch?
So I've started saying this out loud in meetings in the last week, and I don't know how much trouble I'm going to get in for saying it. But yes, there are really solid plans in place. I'll just give you an example for the transportation, the district office. So we've had discussions with the city of Saratoga Springs. So Saratoga Springs is in the midst of building a brand new city and building and library. They plan to be finished with that in November of next year, which is when a new school district board would be elected if Prop 14 passes on the ballot. So one of the discussions that we've had is potentially renting that building for a very, very low cost kind of a dynamic so that we can spread out the cost of that over multiple years. So I think the initial investment in a district office will be very, very low as far as like a financial impact. We've also had conversations about the service bays that are necessary for Transportation West. So one of the challenges with Transportation West is that they don't have service bays. They essentially are kind of like a glorified parking lot. And we need to be able to have bays to kind of complete work. The city has talked about expanding their maintenance. We've talked about whether or not we would pursue potentially, a relationship with them, a contract. I will also say that there have been discussions about different property that potentially be a better fit long-term for the service bays. Once again, I see that as being kind of a multi-year process that really is drawn out. So it will not, I think there's a perception that we have to, immediately drop like $50 million to invest in infrastructure. And that is really, really incorrect. Basically, the cities that we work with, we have the same taxpayers. And so we are very focused on making sure that we can get those needs met in a situation where we are not incurring a ton of infrastructure costs, but able to really kind of do those out over several years, which would be a really minimal impact on the budget. Sorry, did that answer the whole question, Melissa, or was there something else?
I think that followed. I mean, they mentioned, I think they were also talking about kind of duplication of services because nutrition was mentioned. Some of those other kind of things that are run by the district, how would that work, splitting it up? Well, how do you see that working?
So we do have some pieces, right? Like, for example, I think there's an assumption that everything would have to be done in triplicate. And the dynamic right now is that we already have some things being done. Like, for example, we have a Transportation East, a Transportation West. They each have their own transportation director. Would we still need, we're still going to need the same amount of people being routers and whatever. Would there be dynamics that would shift? Yeah. For example, like I've been researching special education in particular. We have one brailleist and one audiologist in ASD. Would we look at doing either a partial contract or, one of the things I'm trying to explore is how many students really do we need to have qualify to need a brailleist before it's really something that we need to invest in? And so I think there are dynamics where we've got to kind of explore what that looks like. And so we don't know all of the answers, but also like this is part of the benefit of having the almost 3 years to do it is that we can start having those conversations and figure it out We don't have to replicate everything. Like, yes, we'll need a superintendent and BA, but like, yes, we'll need HR, nutrition. But instead of having, the amount of people we have running nutrition or HR, it's going to shrink and decrease to meet the needs of employees that we have. I mean, if you look at it in terms of every district in the state of Utah, every charter is smaller than ASD. And all of them, and I would say we have districts that are smaller, way smaller than we are, that are doing phenomenal work. So yes, it's absolutely possible for us to be our own district. Yes, things like a BA and superintendent will be, replicated, those kind of positions, but not everything will. Just another example, we have 3 secondary supervisors. We'd only need 1. In our area, if we become our own district, we have 5 elementary supervisors. We need 1 or 2. So some of those dynamics will shift and adjust according to student population and needs.
I know you mentioned a little bit, we're talking about the programs. We have a question kind of asking again about how is special education going to work? How does that work with programs? I know you mentioned CT earlier. I can't remember if you talked about special ed. If you could just elaborate a little bit on that, that'd be great.
Sure, I did. I broached special education a little bit. The special education funding comes from the state and the federal sectors. So based on, how many students you have that qualify and what their needs are, the funding would come from there. I will also say that we just have a general shortage in special education. I'm concerned about the number of folders that we have resource teachers holding. Our numbers have creeped up significantly. As a board, we have committed to subsidize essentially special education. I'm committed to doing that long-term, regardless of the size of the district. And I think we need to start having really intense conversations about what that support looks ongoing. One of the things that I've said is we're not going to solve every problem with a split. The reality is that education funding is going to continue to be education funding. We're going to continue to have challenges. It's really just you have to choose what you want it to be. Do you want to solve smaller district problems, or do you want to resolve largest district in the state problems? Special education will continue to receive phenomenal services. And I think it's one of the things that we actually need to talk to school board members about when they choose to run for office is what is your commitment to special education and how do you intend to fund those programs?
Okay, we're getting a couple of questions more about information for the school board. Can you just explain what the requirements are to run for school board and what that timeline looks like?
Sure. So school board members, I'm going to see if I get all the pieces right. I don't have the code in front of me, but essentially I think you have to be at least 18. You have to be registered to vote. You have to have resided in the area for at least a full year before the election occurs. And then essentially you have to go down to the county offices and like you have to have lived in the area, like the district that you want to run for. You go down to the county offices, you pay a filing fee, you sign a couple of pieces of paper, and you move forward. So anybody essentially who meets those standards can choose to serve on the Board of Education. So if the split passes on November 5th, basically what happens is then the county will redraw those maps for the districts that we talked about previously. Then the county releases those district maps. People who reside in those areas would go down to the county, file to essentially run. And then it's really up to the voters. The voters have to decide who they want to select as their school board members, and then they would be up for election in November of 2025.
Thank you. Another question regarding kind of what guarantees are in place for teachers? What about their salaries, benefits, and retirement?
So a couple of things, we broached this one a little bit earlier. So we talked about how there's a 1-year guarantee, but I'm working with the legislator to extend that significantly. So we're working on that. So essentially things like salary, step and lane, the retirement dynamic, there's usually 2 questions associated with that. So retirement is really through a state system called URS, or the Utah Retirement System. So those things would exist, whether you're in our district or you go to Jordan or Canyons or Washington County, your URS system essentially follows with you. So those things are protected. Now, ASD does have some specific retirement benefits. We have what's called an early retirement incentive. And then we also provide some medical benefits. So basically, as far as protections, like I said, we're trying to extend the protections several years to kind of put those extensions in place. Everything's protected essentially for a year right now in code. We're trying to make it longer. And the other thing is we talked a little bit about the salary wars and some of those things. it would not be recommended that any district significantly change what ASD is offering, because once again, you're competing for the very best employees. And if you don't offer really solid packages, you're going to end up being in a situation where you're having a harder time finding the best employees to fill positions.
Just looking for more questions. If there's anything that you've heard a question that maybe we haven't gotten to yet that you've heard others ask, if you want to fill that in, or we can get another question, I'm sure, from the group as well.
Probably one I want to address is let's talk a little bit about the transfers, right? Like, what if I want to transfer? How's that going to work in a split? So I think one of the things that's a little bit confusing that people may not understand is that, I've heard some people say that, oh, if there's a split, I'll just stay with ASD because ASD feels solid and stable. I need to clarify, ASD will cease to exist. Basically, when a new district is created, everybody essentially becomes new. So one of the things we did when we were working on the bill is that we were working with a legislator who had served on the Jordan School District a couple of years after the Jordan Canyon split, and they dealt with some problems, I guess, as far as their kind of how they moved forward. So Jordan didn't really change anything with how they were doing things. They had roughly 60% of the kids and 40% of the property taxes, but they weren't really changing everything. They kind of kept doing everything the way they had always done it. And that created some problems, I think, not only with the budget, but I think some of the dynamics that occurred that kind of led to the split in the first place. I'm getting all this second and third hand. But one of the challenges with that we heard is that everybody needs to start fresh instead of just doing the things that you'd always done, because that was problematic in their split. So if you want to transfer, the way that this will work, and we've kind of discussed this a little bit with the superintendent and a couple of other people, this is how we imagine it will go, is that everyone will have a chance to say, I'd really like to serve in this district, whether it's closer to my home, or I'm going to retire in 3 years and I just want to stay with my core team that I really like, or, hey, my kids, we live in this district, we want to be on the same schedule. We're going to try to respect that as much as possible to give employees the right to transfer where they want to be. But at the same time, we've got to be kind of cautious. We don't want to create a dynamic where we've got like a brain drain, or one area in particular, one district does not have the supports that they need. So we're going to honor that as much as we can, while also being intentional to make sure that every district starts out strong so that they have really good supports in place. So basically the way the code is written is whatever school that you're in, when the district splits, which would technically be July 1 of 2027, whatever school you're in, that's the district you're in if you work within a school building. We're looking at changes to code to kind of put in protections for other employees that are not specifically assigned to a school, so that they will have the same, because there's a feeling that maybe there's not the same level of protection. So we're working on that. And then as far as, what if I want to transfer? How is that going to work? Like, will you honor my years? That kind of thing. So I had somebody ask me that question, like, what will happen if like the split happens in 2027, like in 2030, I decide I want to split and go to it. Like, I want to go to a different district than the one I'm serving in. That'll be up to future school boards to decide how many years of service they're going to recognize. But once again, if you want to be competitive and attract the best employees, I think you're going to have solid packages in place to make sure that you're pulling in the best people.
So if I can add to that, but someone just asked, we hear so much about what about the Jordan Canyon split? Why was it so bad? I don't want that to happen again. Someone specifically said, why was there such disparity in the teacher pay between the two districts? Thank you, Katie, for the question.
I'm not an expert in Jordan Canyons. I will say that there were some specific challenges. I mean, obviously, Jordan was in a dynamic where, they still had ongoing building to happen, right? Like, they were in a high growth area. But because they weren't necessarily changing, and once again, this is what people have told me, because they weren't necessarily changing how they were budgeting things, they didn't really shrink to kind of, I guess, meet the student population, if that makes sense. The other thing that's a really big challenge, there were a lot of pieces in code that have been updated since then. There are at least 2 lawsuits associated with Jordan Canyons. And so a lot of the things specifically in the bills that have been updated since then have addressed the issues that led to lawsuits, disparity, that kind of a thing. Like there's a state equalization program that's come into play since then, because the Jordan Canyon split also impacted people like Salt Lake City School District, Granite, and Murray because of the equalization thing that was on a county level instead of a state level. The other thing to be aware of is that they split essentially in the midst of like the Great Recession. So a lot of the things that felt like they were specific to a split were really due to what was happening on the world economic scale. There was also a significant change to the URS system, and that essentially happened in response to what was happening with the Great Recession. So some things that maybe felt like they were because of the split were really because of a state, a nationally, or even I would argue like a worldwide level that we were seeing things shift.
Trying to catch up on the comments here. There's just a lot of comments about what's going on. Talking about, someone mentioned the idea of having a competitive school district to get rid of the transfer policy, and also talking about how professions don't have that, which I think I've heard you talk about as well. Not seeing any new questions yet, though. What else do we have to go through today? Do you have any other ones you wanted to answer?
I think, one of the things that I've heard a little bit is, why did cities get involved? The district was already heading forward, or why did this become an issue? And that's something I want to address, because I think there's been very much, I think, a narrative that this is some kind of like weird political power play. Nobody on city council that I've talked with in anywhere of ASD was like, ooh, nobody got into city council with the intention of doing this. Cities were watching very, very closely, and there was significant concern about what had happened with the bond vote in 2022. If that would be replicated essentially in 2024, if there would be a dynamic where the East Side essentially outvoted the West if the West wanted to leave. And this other dynamic too, it's about political power plays. I think it's completely inaccurate, because right now the school board members in ASD represent more individuals than a House representative does at the state level. And as a school board member, you're still one vote out of seven, regardless of what your board configuration is, and how big the district is, you're still one voice out of seven. And the argument I would make is that we're actually attempting to make government smaller and closer to the people, which I would argue is kind of the antithesis of political power, because instead of being, hey, I represent, X amount of, I represent 50,000 people, the argument's going to be, I represent 10. So I would actually argue that this is a reduction in political power, not a political power grab. And I have to say, just speaking for my interaction with city council members and mayors, not only in the areas that I represent, but across the district, I've been insanely impressed about their level of care. The focus has always been what's the best thing for students. And I think that the second question has been what's best for employees, but the number one question has been what's best for students. And I will say, that has been the core of every discussion we've had, is how do we think this is going to impact students long term? So I just want to clarify for people making those statements, that's 100% inaccurate. This is not about political power plays or anything like that. It's about what's best for all of the students of Alpine School District long term, not just students today and tomorrow, but for a generation of kids to come.
There's been a few questions. I know people had to come and go. This is lunch break for so many. We just want to let you know that we do plan on having this available probably in full on the website, and we also might be making clips from the videos as well to answer the specific questions. There's a question from C asking, what is our strategy to get out the vote?
Ooh, this is where everybody on this Zoom needs to talk to 10 friends every day until I think ballots get mailed in 22 days, if I'm, doing my calculations correctly. Big thing is people need to show up. They need to be concerned about this, because like I said, this will impact generations of students to come in all the municipalities in ASD. Get informed, right? I always ask people, make sure you're casting an informed vote, get the information, talk to people about it. Also talk to your neighbors. I think for me, it feels like it's all I've talked about for the last year and a half. And I'm still surprised that there's people I run into who are completely unaware of it, whether it is, hey, my neighbor's retired and doesn't have kids in school, so they're not getting the email notifications from the district about what's happening in the process, or, people aren't watching city council meetings. Talk to everybody. When you're at the park with your kids, when you're having family dinner on Sunday night, ask, are you registered to vote? Have you heard about this issue? We have a great system in Utah with our mail-in ballot options that make it really easy for anyone to vote. Another thing is going to be, I think the statistics are roughly like 10% of people cast their votes in the first week. And then people forget about it. And sometimes their ballots just sit on the counter and then, election day comes and goes. So a big piece, I think, will also be reaching out to neighbors and say, hey, did you get your ballot? Have you cast your ballot yet? So we just really need to have everybody talk to friends, neighbors, family members about this issue and about making sure that they cast an informed vote.
I think another part of that to add, Julie, is to make sure people are registered to vote. I think that's what you just said, but I think a lot of times we forget that our children that are in college can vote, and also those that have moved. So another question, this is going to be a fun one for you, I think, from Madison. What are the main reasons the other school board members are so opposed to the split? And what are your responses to their reasonings?
I'm going to be trying to be very careful and be fair about this. I would say that I think depending on your area, you're concerned based on if you think you're going to walk away in a positive dynamic or a negative dynamic. I think the MGT study showed pretty clearly there were some disparities across the district as far as funding. I think there's concern in the South area about having a deficit, and then what does that do? Does that reduce programs? I have spoken to city council members all across the district, and I've said, listen, I'll help offer solutions moving forward. There are solutions going forward, whether that is, flipping the high school's 9-12 in the South area so that they have sufficient students to really justify, and they don't have to worry about the comprehensive high school. There needs to be kind of a discussion about what happens with some of those schools that have seismic issues. Is it a rebuild? Is it consolidations? There are solutions. Orem in particular is a very strong tax base. Like I said, they're number 2 in the district. So I do think there's some concern about, are these problems solvable? And I will argue every area of the district has problems. They all have challenges, whether it's growth, whether it's decline, whether it's stability, and everybody has capital projects they need done. So I don't think anybody's walking away just, in a dynamic where all those problems are solved. I think there's going to be challenges moving ahead, but I also think that bringing those closer to the communities, I think, is a better way to solve them. I think if you don't have a $600 million bond pass, but you can have 3 smaller areas pass a $200 million bond, to me, whatever you can do to get those projects moving forward, and if it's a smaller dynamic so that communities are invested in that, I totally think that that's the way to go. So once again, every area gets what they need. Another one is the economies of scale. ASD, because we are the largest district in the state, we enjoy economies of scale. We get, when we're ordering the sheer volume of what we're ordering Chromebooks, we get a better deal than like Tentic does. There are ways we can preserve economies of scale, specifically with purchasing and warehousing, as well as print services that I've talked about previously, where we could create contracts so that we preserve some of those economies of scale. So I would say there are also others who feel like we can pass a bond again, that if we just go forward with a path in like maybe 2025, 2026, and we have a very specific dynamic, that all of the district will support a bond. I don't believe that, but I respect that other board members see it differently and have a different perspective. I think those are probably the the representation issue. I think that's one that I think's been a little bit misunderstood. I think sometimes people think representation is either I don't like my school board member, or where the representation piece is about not like you don't have enough people voting with you. And that's not the reality of representation is. Representation is that, we get our boundaries redrawn for school district seats every decade, basically with a census, because we are growing so fast, particularly in Eagle Mountain and Saratoga Springs. We're always underrepresented because we've had so many people who've been added in the last 2 years, that by the time we go to vote on the seats, we're already underrepresented again. There's been a push to maybe shift to a 9-member board seat. That was something that we actually, I supported with Senator Anderegg when he ran that bill. It makes sense, right? Specifically, the goal was, hey, if we're going to split, you have 3 board members from each area that can, kind of help with each of those 3 areas and get those board seats kind of off the ground and running. I just don't, but we have a 4-3 split. I think it would contribute to a 5-4 split, which really doesn't resolve the issue. And essentially for us to trigger a option where we redistrict outside of the census, basically the board has to come forward and say, yes, we want to redistrict outside of the census. And one of the challenges with that is it essentially someone's probably going to lose a seat. And that's something that, you know, can be a little bit complicated and hard, especially when people are really focused on wanting to serve in the position. And so, yeah, so I would say representation, economies of scale, those are kind of like the ones about the bond. I think those are probably the big ones. And I hope that I fairly represented that. I totally respect and understand that others of, you know, my colleagues see it differently than I do. A lot of times we see the same problems and different paths to solve those problems. And I am just very supportive based on the 6 years that I've served in this capacity. I'm very supportive of a district split moving forward at this point.
Okay, what about the impact of classrooms that are overcrowded? We've got a couple high schools, especially Saratoga, you know, Westlake and Cedar Valley, that are fairly full to capacity. How does that impact learning? What have you seen with sports and classes and everything?
Yeah, so there's some specific challenges with that. I will say it was really interesting because I was at the Westlake cluster meeting earlier today, and that was a common theme, specifically behavior issues and then large class sizes. And one of the challenges is that when you're in, you know, a school dynamic where you only have X amount of classroom spaces, there's only so much you can do. And a lot of times that means class sizes go up. Now, at the same time, do we use portables and satellites? Absolutely. But, you know, we have a lot of times what's called teachers on carts, or traveling teachers, which essentially is a teacher does not have their own room in which to teach a class. So every period, when a teacher's essentially has their prep period, they go to a different teacher's classroom. So there's some challenges with that specifically that I've heard from teachers about. We'll also say one of the challenges is when you have, you know, 3,100, 3,400 kids, there are some ways in which you can flex, right? Marching band is a great example. We have phenomenal marching bands at Westlake and at Cedar Valley High School. You know, you put a lot of kids in those classes, but at the same time, you have really like significant limitations when it comes to football, softball, soccer, basketball. You can only have so many kids on a team, which makes it really hard for kids. One of the things that we're focused on right now is making sure that kids are connected to their schools. And one of the challenges is making sure we can meet that when we have such large schools, to make sure that we don't have kids that maybe get kind of lost in the system. So that's a significant challenge moving forward. And it kind of goes back to the whole idea of why don't you just build elementary schools bigger? We want kids to have a personal connection with their teacher. We want them to know their principal. We want kids to feel safe and connected and engaged at school. And it's challenging. The larger the school gets, the harder it is to know every student's name, to make those individual connections. And our staff are doing a phenomenal job at that. We just want to make sure that, you know, in the challenges we have in some of our West Side schools, those large schools are also contributing to large class sizes because of a lack of capital support.
This question kind of expands this a little bit, specifically talking about Westlake. They're asking about the interim plan for Westlake. What happens if the new high school is delayed? How do we deal with the overcrowding? What is the capacity that the fire marshal will allow in the building?
Oh, wow. Someone asked all the questions. School. So there's, I guess, a couple of different numbers. So there is a, what we call kind of like an optimal capacity, and the optimal capacity is usually, you know, our ratio for secondary schools is generally 27 kids per classroom. If you figure out 27 kids per classroom, the ratio for Westlake is like 1752. That's the brick and mortar, right? Now, can you increase the capacity by adding satellites? Yes, there are essentially 3 at Westlake. Can you increase the capacity by having 33 or 35 kids in a class versus 27? Yes. At what point the fire marshal gets involved, I am unaware because I don't serve in that capacity, so I couldn't speak to that. As far as interim solutions, that I will say that I have a list of things that I've considered. I don't know. I don't know what other people's stance on that is, so I feel a little hesitant to speak about it. When we've talked about it in the past, as far as, you know, what would happen if a bond didn't pass, there were some questions of things like, do we do double sessions? So for anyone who's not aware, a double session is something where like half of the high school comes from 8 to 1 and the other half of the high school comes from 1 to 6. I am not supportive of that. Does double sessions look like half the school goes in person on A day and then they're online on B day? There are some specific challenges associated with us not a delay in this high school because of how large they already are. Could there be a reboundary option where for a couple of years we reboundary a section of Westlake to go to potentially the new middle school and Cedar Valley to buy time? That's something that could be discussed. It could also be adding more portables and satellites. There is a point where we kind of hit capacity and you know, I don't think anything's off the table if there's a delay in the high school. I don't think anything, I would say, yeah, it's anything and everything. I would also say that that is a conversation I would hope we would have in a larger dynamic as a community, because the impact of that would be on, you know, all of us who have kids in school. So I would hope that that would be something where we would have a high level of communication and participation from the community about the best way to move forward.
Can you tell us about some needs on the west side of the district that you believe aren't being served as well? I've heard about Title I, I've heard about homelessness, definitely the sheer capacity of students you've talked about, but what are some things that maybe people that have been following super closely might be not catching some of our needs that we're not getting?
Sure. So Title I is one that's been talked about a lot, and it's interesting because it's when it comes down to budget, it's not a huge part of the budget. Title I's pretty small, but it's something that I think has resonated with a lot of people. Basically, there's a federal designation where you have to have 40% of your student population qualify under the free and reduced meals plan, and then you qualify as Title I. So Mountain Trails had qualified as Title I a long time ago, and then as you know, new developments came in, it really kind of offset the percentages, and they lost it. Mountain Trails has once again qualified as a Title I school. There was a dynamic this past year where there are essentially 4 different state grants we can apply for that contribute about $8 million to our budget to get funding to those Title I schools that have qualified. We found out that 3 of the 4 grants we would no longer be able to apply for. There was a whole thing with a survey and a census that got taken that I'm not going to delve into. Anyways, so it significantly cut our, we lost essentially about $5.5 million in funding overnight. And so the question was, what do we do moving forward? We basically buffered that with about 3.5 million that we subsidized from our general budget to prop up Title I for this year. But then essentially the floor, which is you have to qualify for 40%, got raised. And so the 3 schools that qualified to be added onto Title I this year, including Mountain Trails, did not receive funding. Now they do qualify for a couple of other things. You know, I think if you're a Mountain Trails parent, you may be aware of, they've got the free fruit program where they have kids try new fruits and veggies. They've got some supports from the Boys and Girls Club after school and some things like that because they have qualified as Title I, but they do not currently have any of the funding or any of the district supports that we provide to Title I schools. So that's one example. Another example I can give that's kind of a fast one is just when we looked at things like assigning assistant principals. So previously, if you have 750 kids, there's been a process where we have kind of a scaling model and you essentially get an assistant principal in an elementary school at that point. There was a proposal brought forward to drop that number to 500, meaning that like if you have 500 students, you get an assistant principal. I was supportive of that. And I said, yeah, I think that, you know, we're seeing an increase in behaviors. When we pull principals out of buildings for meetings, it means that secretaries are essentially running the schools, and that's not really fair to them. I am supportive of putting an additional assistant principal in the schools at the 500 instead of 750. But at the same time, that means that when we go up to 1,000 kids in a school, they should get a second AP because we're essentially saying 500 is now the marker. That was not supported. So we have schools that we are adding on assistant principals and things on one end, but not on the other. And I said, well, at least drop it and say, okay, if you qualify at 600, then you qualify at 1,100 or whatever. Like, can we find a middle road? And that was not something that was considered. There was a presentation that was given in the last study session where we talked specifically about some of the community schools that are occurring. We have a significant need in Westlake and Cedar Valley. We've had a huge uptick in multi-language learners, as well as our kiddos who qualify for McKinney-Vento, which is the federal program in which kids are designated as being homeless. We have, I think currently, I want to say it's 217 students in our area that qualify under McKinney-Vento, which is less than some of the other bigger areas like Orem. So we don't have the same level of supports. We also have some specific challenges with our area when it comes to things like food pantries, public transportation, medical services that are just not out here in this area yet, that kind of really exacerbates the issue. Those are just a couple of examples. I could go into it. I could probably talk for like 3 hours about that piece alone.
No, I think that's good. You covered that.
Okay.
We've got one other question, and then I want to do one last call for questions because we want to wrap things up as close to an hour as possible. So more interest about the new high school. Look in your crystal ball. When's the soonest date we could get a new high school and move into it? Thank you, Shauna.
Okay, crystal ball. It feels like a magic 8 ball where it's just like, ask again later. I will say that I've had a couple conversations with the legislators about a couple of ideas on how to free up some of the funding dynamics. Everyone I've talked to has been supportive because the ideas I'm trying to throw out are very specific to trying to be fair to all municipalities. I understand the perspective of other municipalities who may have the idea of like, listen, I don't want to be stuck with the debt for 20 years of a high school that I'm not benefiting from or is no longer in my district. I totally understand that, respect that, which is why I'm trying to work on a couple different mechanisms. If we can get these funding options through that would kind of pull off some of the restrictions, we could start digging in March and April. That's depending on if we can get the bill to pass with the updated code, and we can have support to move forward. I think that's a real possibility, but it's going to require a heavy lift because instead of the 7 of us coming to a conclusion, which was my best case scenario, which is, hey, let's build the high school and move forward. It's going to be instead bringing in a lot of other legislators and kind of getting them to understand the problem and why we need some flexibility associated with it. I think it's very, very possible. I don't know what's probable. I think it's highly, highly possible that we can get the funding mechanisms approved. That's I think it's probably as far as I'm willing to step out on that ledge, if that is fair. Because like I said, I want to be fair, and I don't want to overpromise things that I can't deliver on.
I think that was a great way to look at it. Okay, so we're going to kind of wrap things up. I haven't seen their questions. The last question for you is if someone stops you in the grocery store or at the mailbox and asks you why you should vote yes for Prop 14, what are the main reasons you'd sum up to tell them why to vote? What can you help us with to share our neighbors, basically, and the main reasons?
Yeah, for me, a big piece is local representation. For our area, right? Like, I swear there's something that pops up on social media every day about like the light being out on Pioneer and Redwood. And like we all get stuck, in that traffic, or it's like, oh, it's gonna take me 45 minutes to get home because it's after 3 o'clock. I think there's a different dynamic when, you don't have to explain growth to somebody here because we live the reality of it every day. So I would say local representation is a big issue. Another one for me is, taxes being able to stay local. Like I said, to me, that's not about, I want to take my money and run. I want AF and PG to have their high school rebuilds. I want Orem to be able to deal with their seismic issues. And I think that by taking it more local, you get more local support and a community will to support those kind of things. And then another thing for me is just being able to really decide what's most important in your area. Like when you're electing your school board, is it special education? Is it CTE? Is it concurrent enrollment? Like what's the most important thing to you, and being able to communicate that with people. And people do stop me in Costco. My kids won't go with me anymore because they know it's going to be a 45-minute conversation. But those are the things to me. It's local representation, local taxes, and just being able to make really local decisions.
Awesome.
I think that's great.
Well, thank
ahead,
you
Melissa.
everyone for joining us. We'll be posting this on social media and on our website. And if you have any questions, please Visit www.westdistrict.org. If you'd like a yard sign, you can visit there too, and we're always looking for donations to help support this cause. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to Julie. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.